The morning mist clung to Charleston Harbor like a shroud of impending doom on April 12, 1861. Major Robert Anderson stood atop the ramparts of Fort Sumter, his weathered hands gripping the cold stone as he gazed across the water at the Confederate batteries that had sprouted like deadly mushrooms around the harbor. The fort, an artificial island of masonry and determination, had become the epicenter of a nation's fracture. Anderson, a Kentucky-born officer with 37 years of military service, had never imagined he would find himself at the heart of such a momentous crisis. The Union garrison under his command consisted of merely 85 men, including laborers and musicians pressed into service as soldiers. They were vastly outnumbered by the thousands of Confederate troops that General Pierre-Gustave Beauregard had positioned strategically around Charleston Harbor. The fort itself was a marvel of military engineering, designed by Joseph Gilbert Totten and built on a man-made island at the harbor's mouth. Its five-sided structure rose 50 feet above the water, with walls 8 to 12 feet thick. Yet for all its imposing presence, Fort Sumter had become a symbol of division rather than strength. The Confederate States of America, formed just 2 months prior, viewed the federal garrison as an unwelcome occupying force in what they now considered sovereign territory. President Abraham Lincoln faced an impossible dilemma. Supply ships carrying food and provisions had been denied passage by Confederate authorities, leaving Anderson's garrison with dwindling supplies. The men were down to their last barrels of pork and hardtack, with barely enough ammunition for a week-long siege. Lincoln's cabinet was split between those who favored evacuation to avoid war and those who insisted that abandoning federal property would legitimize secession. As reported in contemporary accounts from the Charleston Mercury, tensions had been escalating since South Carolina's secession on December 20th, 1860. The state had demanded the immediate evacuation of all federal forces, considering their presence an act of aggression against the newly formed Confederacy. Governor Francis Wilkinson Pickens had been particularly vocal, declaring that no foreign flag would be permitted to fly over South Carolina soil. The Confederate batteries surrounding the harbor presented a formidable sight. Fort Moultrie, once Anderson's previous posting before his strategic withdrawal to Sumter, now bristled with Confederate cannon pointed directly at his current position. The Iron Battery on Cummings Point, Morris Island Battery, and the floating battery moored nearby created an almost impenetrable ring of artillery. General Beauregard, a former student of Anderson's at West Point, had positioned these guns with mathematical precision. Inside Fort Sumter, the Union soldiers went about their duties with grim determination. They knew that their small garrison had become the flashpoint for something far greater than themselves. Captain Abner Doubleday, the fort's second-in-command, supervised the positioning of their limited artillery while Dr. Samuel Wiley Crawford, the fort surgeon, tended to the growing anxiety among the men. The civilians of Charleston watched from their rooftops and harborfront mansions as this deadly chess game unfolded. Many had gathered at the Battery, the city's fashionable promenade, turning the potential bombardment into a social event. Ladies in their finest dresses and gentlemen in top hats created an incongruous scene of Southern society preparing to witness the birth of a war. As the sun set on April 11th, casting long shadows across the harbor, both sides knew that the morning would bring either peaceful resolution or the first shots of what would become America's bloodiest conflict. The stage was set, the players positioned, and history held its breath. The pre-dawn darkness of April 12, 1861, was broken by the sound of oars cutting through Charleston Harbor's calm waters. 3 Confederate officers rowed steadily toward Fort Sumter under a flag of truce, their small boat carrying what would prove to be the war's final diplomatic gesture. Colonel James Chestnut, Jr., Captain Stephen Dill Lee, and Lieutenant Alexander Robert Chisholm had been dispatched by General Beauregard with an ultimatum that would echo through American history. Major Anderson watched their approach from the fort's sally port, his mind racing through the implications of this pre-dawn visit. He had been expecting this moment for weeks, knowing that the Confederacy would not allow the federal garrison to remain indefinitely. The Major's adjutant, Captain Jefferson Columbus Davis, stood beside him, both men understanding that whatever message these officers carried would likely determine the fate of their small command. The Confederate delegation was received in Anderson's quarters, a Spartan room that reflected the fort's diminished supplies and the gravity of their situation. Colonel Chestnut, a former United States Senator and husband to the diarist Mary Boykin Chestnut, presented the formal demand with military courtesy despite the political tensions. The ultimatum was clear and uncompromising: evacuate Fort Sumter immediately and peacefully, or face bombardment at a time of General Beauregard's choosing. Anderson read the document carefully, his experienced eyes taking in every word of what he knew might be the last peaceful communication between North and South. The ultimatum gave him 1 hour to respond, stating that if he refused to evacuate, Confederate batteries would open fire in 1 hour from this time. The Major's response was measured but resolute. He would not surrender the fort without orders from his government in Washington, but he expressed hope that General Beauregard would not force the issue through violence. As the Confederate officers prepared to depart, Anderson made a remark that would prove prophetic. He mentioned to Colonel Chestnut that if the Confederates did not batter his garrison to pieces, they would be starved out in a few days anyway. This observation, while tactically honest, inadvertently revealed the Union's desperate supply situation and may have influenced the Confederate decision to proceed with immediate action rather than wait for starvation to do their work. The return journey of the Confederate delegation marked the end of diplomatic efforts. As their boat disappeared into the morning mist, both sides made final preparations for what was now inevitable. In Charleston, church bells began ringing at 4 o'clock in the morning, awakening citizens who flocked to rooftops, balconies, and the Battery to witness what many believed would be a brief and decisive bombardment. According to accounts preserved in the Charleston Courier, the city had taken on a festive atmosphere despite the gravity of the situation. Hotels served early breakfasts to accommodate the crowds, and enterprising vendors sold refreshments to spectators gathered along the waterfront. Many Charleston residents viewed the impending bombardment as a necessary assertion of Southern independence, with little anticipation of the prolonged and devastating war that would follow. Inside Fort Sumter, Anderson called his officers together for a final council of war. The garrison's situation was indeed desperate. They had perhaps 6 days of food remaining, insufficient medical supplies, and limited ammunition for their 48 guns, only about half of which could be effectively manned with their small force. Captain Doubleday noted in his journal that the men were determined to make a good showing despite their disadvantages. The Union soldiers spent their remaining time preparing for bombardment. They moved supplies away from vulnerable positions, secured loose equipment, and made peace with their situation. Many wrote letters home, understanding that these might be their last communications with loved ones. The fort's chaplain held an impromptu service, and the garrison raised the American flag with particular ceremony, knowing it might be the last time they would do so as free men. As the clock approached 4:30 in the morning, the harbor fell into an eerie silence. Even the seabirds seemed to sense the tension, their usual dawn chorus notably absent. Both Confederate and Union forces waited in their positions, finger on triggers, eyes fixed on their targets. The next few hours would transform Fort Sumter from a symbol of federal authority into the birthplace of American Civil War. At exactly 4:30 in the morning on April 12, 1861, the silence of Charleston Harbor was shattered by the thunderous roar of a mortar shell arcing through the pre-dawn sky. The projectile, fired from Fort Johnson by Captain George Sumter James, traced a brilliant path against the dark heavens before exploding directly over Fort Sumter in a burst of fire and smoke that would ignite 4 years of unprecedented bloodshed. The honor of firing this historic first shot had been offered to Roger Atkinson Pryor, a fiery Virginia secessionist and former United States congressman who had traveled to Charleston to witness the momentous occasion. However, when faced with the actual moment of pulling the lanyard that would begin civil war, Pryor declined, reportedly saying he could not fire the first gun of the war. The responsibility thus fell to Captain James, whose mortar shell became the opening note of America's bloodiest symphony. Within moments of James's shot, the entire Confederate ring of batteries erupted in coordinated fury. General Beauregard had positioned his artillery with mathematical precision, creating overlapping fields of fire that would subject Fort Sumter to bombardment from multiple angles simultaneously. The Iron Battery, commanded by Captain Hamilton Cooper Boykin, sent solid shot crashing into the fort's thick masonry walls. From Morris Island, the batteries under Colonel Roswell Sabine Ripley added their voices to the deadly chorus, while the Floating Battery, an innovative Confederate creation, lobbed shells from its protected position near Sullivan's Island. Inside Fort Sumter, Major Anderson's garrison responded to the bombardment with remarkable composure. Captain Abner Doubleday had the distinction of firing the Union's first shot in return, aiming his cannon at the Iron Battery on Cummings Point. As he later wrote in his memoirs, he deliberately aimed at the Confederate flag flying over the battery, though his shot fell short of its target. The symbolism was not lost on either side. The war had begun with each combatant aiming at the other's colors. The bombardment created a spectacular display that could be witnessed from across Charleston. According to contemporary reports in the Charleston Mercury, thousands of spectators gathered on rooftops, balconies, and along the waterfront to watch the historic event unfold. Many treated the occasion as a grand entertainment, with hotel proprietors serving special breakfasts and vendors hawking refreshments to the crowds. The social elite of Charleston society made a holiday of what they assumed would be a brief and decisive victory. The Confederate artillery proved devastatingly accurate. Shell after shell crashed into Fort Sumter's walls, sending cascades of brick and mortar debris raining down into the parade ground. The fort's flagstaff was struck repeatedly, requiring Sergeant John Carmody and several volunteers to brave the falling projectiles to keep the stars and stripes flying. Each time the flag fell, Confederate batteries would temporarily cease fire in the mistaken belief that Anderson had surrendered, only to resume their bombardment when the colors were raised again. Anderson faced a terrible tactical dilemma. His garrison of fewer than 90 men could effectively man only a fraction of the fort's guns, and he had orders to conserve ammunition for a prolonged siege. The major made the difficult decision to limit their response to the lower tier of guns, abandoning the more powerful barbette guns on the upper level due to lack of personnel and the exposed nature of those positions. This conservative approach, while militarily sound given his circumstances, meant that Fort Sumter's return fire was far less effective than it might have been. The Union gunners, led by experienced artillery officers like Captain Truman Seymour and Lieutenant Norman Jonathan Hall, worked their pieces with professional determination despite the overwhelming odds. They concentrated their fire on the most threatening Confederate positions, particularly the Iron Battery and the Enfilade Battery on Sullivan's Island. However, their solid shot made little impression on the well-protected Confederate positions, many of which had been reinforced with sandbags and cotton bales. As the morning progressed, the intensity of the bombardment never slackened. Confederate gunners, many of them members of Charleston's elite military academies and social clubs, maintained a steady rate of fire that averaged one shot every few minutes from each battery. The cumulative effect was overwhelming. By noon, over 1,000 shells had been fired at the small fort, creating a continuous rain of metal and masonry that made movement in the open extremely hazardous for Anderson's men. Despite the ferocity of the bombardment, remarkably, no one on either side had yet been killed or seriously wounded, though this miraculous situation would not long continue. By noon on April 12, 1861, Fort Sumter had endured nearly 8 hours of continuous bombardment without respite. The Confederate shells had transformed the once proud fortress into a battered hulk, with great chunks of masonry blown from its walls, and the parade ground littered with debris. Yet Major Anderson's garrison continued their defiant resistance, their return fire growing more desperate as their situation became increasingly untenable. The most critical moment came when Confederate hotshot, cannonballs heated red-hot in furnaces, began setting fire to the fort's wooden structures. The officers' quarters, built against the interior walls, erupted in flames that spread rapidly through the dry timber. The fort's hospital, commissary, and other essential buildings were soon engulfed, sending thick black smoke billowing across the harbor and creating a new hazard for Anderson's men, who now faced suffocation as well as enemy fire. Captain Peter Hart, the fort's ordnance sergeant, displayed extraordinary courage in attempting to fight the fires while shells continued to rain down around him. Working with a small detail of volunteers, Hart and his men used the fort's limited water supply to battle the flames, but their efforts were largely futile against the spreading conflagration. The smoke became so dense that Confederate gunners across the harbor temporarily slowed their rate of fire, unable to clearly see their target through the thick pall. The fire created a cascading series of crises for the Union garrison. As flames approached the fort's main powder magazine, containing several thousand pounds of gunpowder, Anderson faced the terrifying possibility of a catastrophic explosion that would instantly kill everyone inside the fort. Acting with characteristic coolness under pressure, the major ordered his men to move the most dangerous powder charges to safer locations while creating fire breaks by tearing down wooden partitions and soaking walls with their precious water reserves. Lieutenant Norman Hall, working alongside Sergeant Carmody, made repeated trips through the smoke-filled passages to rescue ammunition and supplies from the advancing flames. Their heroic efforts prevented the fire from reaching the main magazine, though several smaller powder stores were lost. The heat became so intense that the garrison's flagstaff was burned through, once again bringing down the stars and stripes and causing another temporary pause in Confederate firing. As documented in reports from the New York Herald correspondent who witnessed the bombardment from Charleston, the site of Fort Sumter, wreathed in flames and smoke, created a dramatic spectacle that awed even the Confederate spectators. Many Charleston residents, who had initially viewed the bombardment as entertainment, began to express concern for the Union garrison's safety, recognizing the very real danger posed by the combination of enemy fire and uncontrolled flames. The afternoon brought new challenges as the Confederate batteries adjusted their fire to take advantage of the fort's weakened condition. General Beauregard's gunners concentrated their efforts on the sections of wall that had been most damaged by the morning's bombardment, systematically widening breaches and creating potential assault routes. The floating battery proved particularly effective during this phase, its protected position allowing sustained, accurate fire against the fort's sea-facing walls. Inside the burning fort, Anderson called a council of his officers to assess their increasingly desperate situation. Captain Doubleday reported that their effective ammunition was nearly exhausted, with only a few rounds remaining for each serviceable gun. Dr. Crawford noted that while they had suffered no battle casualties, several men were showing signs of smoke inhalation and exhaustion. The fort's water supply had been largely consumed in fighting fires, leaving the garrison facing dehydration in addition to their other troubles. The major faced an agonizing decision. Military honor demanded continued resistance, but practical considerations suggested that further fighting would only result in unnecessary casualties among his brave garrison. The fort's defensive capability had been largely destroyed by fire and bombardment, and surrender appeared inevitable. Yet Anderson was reluctant to lower his flag without explicit orders from Washington, knowing that such an act would be seen as abandoning federal authority in the seceded states. As evening approached, the Confederate bombardment continued with undiminished intensity. The setting sun painted the smoke-shrouded harbor in shades of red and orange that seemed to prophesy the bloody conflict ahead. Both sides understood that this first day of fighting was merely the beginning of something far larger and more terrible than anyone yet imagined. The night would bring new trials for Anderson's embattled garrison, as they struggled to maintain their position in a fort that had become as dangerous from internal fires as from external bombardment. The second day of bombardment, April 13, 1861, dawned with renewed fury as Confederate batteries resumed their relentless assault on the smoke-blackened walls of Fort Sumter. Major Anderson's garrison had spent a sleepless night fighting fires, manning their few remaining serviceable guns, and contemplating their increasingly hopeless situation. The morning light revealed the devastating effectiveness of the previous day's bombardment. Great sections of the fort's walls had been reduced to rubble, and smoke continued to rise from smoldering ruins within the compound. Anderson gathered his officers for what would prove to be their final council of war. Captain Doubleday reported that they had exhausted their supply of cartridges for the larger guns and could manage only 6 more rounds for their smaller pieces. The fort's flagstaff had been shot away 3 times and hastily repaired each time by volunteers who risked their lives to keep the stars and stripes flying. More critically, the fire had consumed most of their remaining food supplies, leaving the garrison with only a small quantity of pork and some damaged hardtack. The most immediate danger came from the advancing flames, which had now reached dangerously close to the main powder magazine despite the garrison's heroic firefighting efforts. The fort's ventilation system, damaged by shell fire, was drawing smoke into every corner of the structure, making breathing increasingly difficult. Several men had collapsed from smoke inhalation, and Dr. Crawford warned that the garrison's combat effectiveness was rapidly deteriorating. At approximately 11 o'clock in the morning, as Confederate shells continued to rain down upon the battered fortress, Anderson made the painful decision that military necessity demanded. With his ammunition nearly exhausted, his fort on fire, and his men facing imminent danger from explosion or suffocation, the major authorized Captain Doubleday to raise a white flag above the fort's ramparts. The decision came not from cowardice, but from the recognition that further resistance would serve no military purpose while needlessly endangering his brave soldiers' lives. The appearance of the white flag created immediate excitement among the Confederate batteries and the watching crowds in Charleston. General Beauregard, observing the bombardment from his headquarters, ordered an immediate ceasefire when he spotted the surrender signal. The sudden silence that fell over Charleston Harbor after 34 hours of continuous bombardment seemed almost supernatural to those who had grown accustomed to the constant thunder of artillery. Louis Trezevant Wigfall, a former United States Senator from Texas who had been serving as an aide to General Beauregard, took it upon himself to row out to Fort Sumter to accept Anderson's surrender. Wigfall, accompanied by several other Confederate officers, approached the fort under a flag of truce, his small boat navigating carefully through the debris-filled waters around the artificial island. His arrival at Fort Sumter marked the formal beginning of surrender negotiations. According to contemporary accounts in the Richmond Examiner, Wigfall's impromptu diplomatic mission created some confusion, as he lacked official authority to negotiate terms. However, Anderson, recognizing the futility of his position, agreed to discuss surrender conditions while waiting for properly authorized Confederate representatives. The major's primary concern was securing honorable terms that would allow his garrison to depart with dignity intact and without being treated as prisoners of war. General Beauregard, upon learning of Wigfall's unauthorized mission, immediately dispatched his official representatives to formalize the surrender negotiations. Colonel Chestnut, who had delivered the original ultimatum, returned to Fort Sumter accompanied by Captain Lee and other Confederate officers, authorized to accept Anderson's surrender and establish the specific terms of evacuation. The negotiations proceeded with remarkable courtesy between former comrades who had served together in the United States Army before secession divided their loyalties. Anderson's reputation as an honorable officer and his garrison's brave resistance had earned the respect of their Confederate opponents, who were inclined to offer generous terms. Beauregard, perhaps influenced by his former relationship as Anderson's student at West Point, proved magnanimous in victory. The agreed terms of surrender reflected the mutual respect between professional soldiers on both sides. Anderson's garrison would be allowed to retain their personal arms and property, salute their flag with 50 guns, and depart Charleston Harbor aboard a Union vessel with full military honors. The Confederate authorities would provide transportation to any Union port the garrison preferred, treating the surrendering soldiers as honored opponents rather than captured prisoners. As the formal surrender document was signed in Anderson's smoke-stained quarters, both sides recognized that they had participated in something far more significant than a simple military engagement. Fort Sumter had become the birthplace of American Civil War, and its surrender marked the end of the last federal presence in South Carolina. The implications would soon extend far beyond Charleston Harbor. April 14, 1861, dawned clear and beautiful over Charleston Harbor, providing a stark contrast to the somber ceremony that was about to unfold at Fort Sumter. Major Anderson had negotiated the right for his garrison to fire a 50-gun salute to the American flag before lowering it for the final time, a gesture of honor that both sides agreed would provide appropriate dignity to the Union surrender. What should have been a purely ceremonial conclusion to the bombardment would instead produce the first casualties of America's Civil War. The morning preparations proceeded with military precision as Anderson's men, despite their exhaustion from 34 hours under fire, worked to present their best appearance for the surrender ceremony. The garrison had managed to clean their uniforms and polish their equipment, determined to maintain their honor even in defeat. The Confederate authorities had agreed to allow Union transport ships into the harbor to evacuate the garrison, and the merchant vessel Isabel waited nearby to carry Anderson's command to northern ports. General Beauregard had extended remarkable courtesy to his defeated opponents, providing supplies for their journey and allowing them to retain all personal property. The Confederate commander's magnanimous treatment reflected both his respect for Anderson personally and his desire to demonstrate Southern chivalry to watching Northern observers. Representatives from both sides understood that their conduct during these final hours would be scrutinized by the entire nation. The ceremony began at 2 o'clock in the afternoon, with Anderson's men formed in precise ranks on the fort's damaged parade ground. The American flag, which had flown throughout the bombardment despite repeated hits on the flagstaff, was prepared for its final salute. Captain Doubleday supervised the positioning of the cannon that would fire the honorary salvo, using the fort's remaining serviceable guns to provide the traditional military farewell to the colors. Confederate spectators gathered once again on Charleston's waterfront and rooftops. But the atmosphere was notably different from the festive mood that had prevailed during the bombardment. Many observers seemed to sense the gravity of the moment, understanding that they were witnessing not just a military surrender, but the symbolic end of the old Union. The presence of Union ships in the harbor, come to evacuate Anderson's garrison, served as a reminder that this local victory was merely the opening move in what promised to be a much larger conflict. The tragedy struck during the 36th round of the ceremonial salute. As Private Daniel Hofe served his cannon, a spark from the previous discharge ignited a pile of cartridges, causing a premature explosion that killed him instantly and mortally wounded Private Edward Galloway, who died several days later from his injuries. The explosion also wounded several other soldiers, including Private George Fielding, who suffered severe burns but eventually recovered. This accidental blast created the bitter irony that Fort Sumter's first battle casualties came not from enemy action, but from their own farewell salute. Private Hofe thus earned the grim distinction of being the first soldier to die in the Civil War, killed not by Confederate fire, but by the very ceremony meant to honor his service. The tragedy cast a somber pall over the surrender proceedings and seemed to foreshadow the massive casualties that would characterize the coming conflict. Major Anderson, deeply affected by this tragic turn of events, immediately ordered the salute discontinued after consulting with his officers and the Confederate representatives present. The remaining 14 rounds of the planned 50-gun salute were abandoned out of respect for the dead and wounded, though Anderson had successfully demonstrated his garrison's continued discipline and fighting spirit even in the face of surrender. As documented in reports that appeared in Harper's Weekly, the funeral ceremony for Private Howe was conducted with full military honors, attended by both Union and Confederate officers. The young soldier was buried in Charleston, his grave marked with a simple wooden cross that would later be replaced with a proper military headstone. His death served as a sobering reminder that war, even when conducted with the greatest courtesy and chivalry, inevitably claimed innocent lives. The lowering of the American flag proceeded with quiet dignity after the tragic interruption. Anderson personally supervised the careful folding of the colors that had flown throughout the bombardment, preserving the bullet-torn banner as a symbol of his garrison's courage and devotion. The flag would eventually be taken north, where it would become a powerful rallying symbol for Union cause throughout the war. As the ceremony concluded and Anderson's men prepared to board their transport vessel, both sides maintained the respectful demeanor that had characterized the entire surrender process. Confederate soldiers presented arms as the Union garrison marched to their boats, while military bands played appropriate martial airs. The professional courtesy displayed by both armies would unfortunately prove to be one of the last examples of such chivalrous conduct in the brutal war that was about to begin. As the Union transport vessel Isabel steamed out of Charleston Harbor on the afternoon of April 14, 1861, carrying Major Anderson's garrison away from the scene of their honorable surrender, the implications of the past 2 days began to reverberate across a nation already teetering on the brink of dissolution. The bombardment of Fort Sumter had lasted 34 hours and involved the firing of over 4,000 rounds, yet miraculously, no lives had been lost to enemy action. The only casualties of America's first battle came from the tragic accident during the surrender ceremony, a bitter irony that would be remembered throughout the war that followed. President Lincoln received news of Fort Sumter's surrender via telegraph on the morning of April 14th, the same day that Anderson's garrison departed Charleston. The president's response was swift and decisive, reflecting months of careful preparation for this moment. On April 15th, Lincoln issued a proclamation calling for 75,000 volunteers to serve for 90 days to suppress the rebellion in South Carolina and restore federal authority. This call to arms would prove to be just the beginning of a conflict that would ultimately require over 2 million Union soldiers and last 4 devastating years. The president's call for volunteers had immediate and profound consequences throughout the remaining slave states that had not yet seceded. Virginia, North Carolina, Tennessee, and Arkansas had remained in the Union despite the formation of the Confederacy. But Lincoln's military response to Fort Sumter pushed these states into the Confederate camp. Virginia's secession on April 17th was particularly significant, as it brought the Confederate capital to Richmond, just 100 miles from Washington, and added the military genius of Robert Edward Lee to the Southern cause. In the North, the attack on Fort Sumter galvanized public opinion in favor of preserving the Union. Cities across the loyal states witnessed massive patriotic demonstrations as volunteers rushed to enlist in response to Lincoln's call. The flag that Anderson had defended so gallantly at Fort Sumter became a powerful symbol of Union determination, displayed prominently at rallies and recruitment meetings throughout the northern states. Major Anderson himself became a national hero, lionized in the press and celebrated in popular songs and poetry. The Confederate States, meanwhile, celebrated their victory at Fort Sumter as validation of their decision to secede and proof of their ability to defend their independence. General Beauregard was hailed as a hero throughout the South, and the successful bombardment was seen as evidence that Southern military prowess would quickly bring international recognition and Union acquiescence to Confederate independence. Few on either side anticipated the scale and duration of the conflict that Fort Sumter had unleashed. Charleston itself became a symbol of Confederate defiance, with Fort Sumter serving as a powerful reminder of Southern resolve. The fort was quickly occupied by Confederate forces and incorporated into Charleston's harbor defenses, where it would remain under Southern control for nearly 4 years. The city's residents, who had treated the bombardment as entertainment, would soon experience the harsh realities of war as Charleston became a primary target for Union forces determined to recapture the symbolic birthplace of rebellion. The international community watched the events at Fort Sumter with intense interest, recognizing that the American conflict would have global implications. European powers, particularly Great Britain and France, saw potential opportunities in American division but remained officially neutral while carefully monitoring developments. The cotton kingdoms of the South had counted on European intervention on their behalf, but the attack on Fort Sumter was seen by many foreign observers as Southern aggression that complicated diplomatic recognition of Confederate independence. Major Anderson's personal fate after Fort Sumter reflected the complex loyalties that the war created within American families and institutions. Though he had surrendered the fort, Anderson remained a loyal Union officer and was promoted to brigadier general. However, his Kentucky birth and Southern connections made his position complicated, and he spent much of the war in administrative roles rather than field commands. His surrender at Fort Sumter, initially seen as a defeat, was later recognized as a strategic victory that unified Northern opinion and provided moral justification for the war effort. The transformation of Fort Sumter from federal fortress to Confederate stronghold to Union target would continue throughout the war. The fort would endure massive bombardments from Union naval and land forces attempting to recapture Charleston, suffering damage that dwarfed the relatively light artillery fire it had received in April 1861. By war's end, the once proud fortress would be reduced to rubble, but its symbolic importance would remain intact as the place where American Civil War began. As historians would later recognize, the Battle of Fort Sumter marked far more than the beginning of military hostilities between North and South. It represented the final failure of compromise and negotiation to resolve the fundamental contradictions in American society regarding slavery, states' rights, and federal authority. The shots fired in Charleston Harbor on April 12, 1861, echoed across 4 years of unprecedented bloodshed that would ultimately preserve the Union, end slavery, and transform the United States into a modern industrial nation. The thunder of those first guns had announced not just the beginning of war, but the birth of a new America forged in the crucible of civil conflict.